Hey there. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to be digging into stimulants, which I know is something you've been wanting to explore more of, especially because of your interest in. Mention the listener's reason for wanting to learn about this topic. We usually hear about stimulants when it comes to things like ADHD or even some, well, illicit substances, but honestly, their reach is way broader than that.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a really interesting area to get into because stimulants, when you really get down to it, get to the core of how our brains work. How we're motivated, how we feel pleasure, even how we function as a society.
So let's break this down a little. When we even say the word stimulant, what are we actually talking about? What's going on in the brain and the body when someone takes a stimulant?
Okay, so imagine this. Your brain's like a car engine, right? And dopamine is the fuel. It's this neurotransmitter that's basically the key to our brain's whole reward system.
Yeah.
That feeling of like, I feel good or satisfied when maybe you achieve a goal or something, or heck, even just eating a piece of chocolate.
Okay, I'm with you.
Right, so stimulants, what they do is they basically slam down on the accelerator. They just flood your system with dopamine.
Oh, wow.
And that's why we feel that high or that super focus feeling. It's all that dopamine.
So it's like kind of hijacking the brain's reward system in a way?
Exactly. It's like manually hitting that reward button. And then because of that dopamine surge, it triggers all these other things in the body. Heart rate, blood pressure goes up. Your pupils get bigger. Even your breathing can speed up. And then you feel all this energy. You don't really need to sleep as much, maybe not even eat as much. But here's the thing. A lot of people don't realize this, but not every stimulant works the exact same way.
Really? I always thought they all basically did the same thing, just like some are stronger than others.
Yeah, that's a really common misconception, actually. So, think about caffeine, your morning coffee. That's a stimulant, too.
Oh.
It mainly blocks this other neurotransmitter called adenosine, which makes us feel sleepy, which then kind of indirectly increases dopamine, but it's a roundabout way of getting there. If you compare that to something like cocaine, that actually directly blocks dopamine from being reabsorbed into the brain,
Oh, wow.
which creates a much faster and much more intense dopamine surge, and obviously has much stronger effects.
So there really are big differences in how they actually work. It's not just about more dopamine. It's a lot more complex than that. This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. It's like we've unlocked this whole secret level of stimulants. But now I'm curious, like knowing all this, how common are these substances really? It's not like everyone's walking around like a pocket full of cocaine or anything.
And yet, at the same time, stimulant use is way more common than a lot of people realize. Like, remember we were talking about that cup of coffee?
Right.
That right there, that's stimulant use.
Yeah, true. Caffeine is such a part of like our everyday life that you almost forget it. It even falls under this whole umbrella of stimulant.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that not all stimulant use is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, millions of people use caffeine totally fine every single day. But then you've got prescription stimulants, which are also incredibly common. In fact, our research shows that in 2021, there were over 19 million Americans using prescription stimulants like Adderall.
19 million, that's a huge number. It really puts it into perspective how widespread stimulant use is. I will say that when I think of prescription stimulants, my mind does immediately go to ADHD.
And that's definitely a big part of it. Stimulants like Adderall, Ritalin, things like that, they can be really helpful for people with ADHD to kind of manage their symptoms, help them focus, control their impulses, just kind of function better in their day-to-day lives. But it's not just limited to ADHD anymore. I mean, we're seeing an increase in prescriptions for stimulants across all different age groups and for all sorts of different reasons.
So what's causing this trend? Why are we seeing more people using prescription stimulants now than ever before?
Well, there's a lot of different factors at play. Some experts think it's because there's just more awareness about things like ADHD now, so more people are getting diagnosed and treated. But others point to like the pressures of our modern world. It's like everything's so fast-paced and we're expected to be on all the time, so people are turning to stimulants to help them be more productive, to get ahead, or even just keep up.
It's like the pressure cooker of modern life is kind of pushing people towards these substances. And that makes you think about the other side of it too, right? I mean, we've been talking about the upside, the focus and the energy, the feeling of being on, but like what happens when you come down?
Well, that's where things can get kind of complicated because remember how we were talking about how stimulants work? They flood your brain with all that dopamine. They're basically like hitting the reward button over and over and over again. And when that happens for a long time, your brain starts to kind of get used to it. It adapts. It actually starts producing less dopamine naturally because it's getting it from somewhere else. And it becomes more and more reliant on that external source, that stimulant, just to function normally. And that is how dependence
And
develops.
that dependence, that's where the risk of addiction comes in.
Exactly. Addiction is a complicated thing, but at its core, it's basically when someone feels like they can't stop using a substance, in this case a stimulant, even though it's having negative consequences in their life. And the withdrawal symptoms that come with stopping stimulant use, they can be really, really tough, which makes it that much harder to break that cycle of dependence.
You mentioned withdrawal symptoms. What actually happens to the body when someone who's become dependent on stimulants stops using them? Like, paint us a picture here. What kinds of things might they go through?
Well, it can be really different for everyone. It depends on a lot of things. The specific stimulant they were using, how long they were using it, how much, and then just individual factors like their genetics and overall health. But in general, stimulant withdrawal, it's kind of like your body slamming on the brakes after driving really, really fast, except the brakes aren't working quite right, so it's not exactly a smooth ride.
Okay, so walk us through this bumpy ride then. What are some of the most common things someone might experience when they're going through stimulant withdrawal?
So in those first few hours or even days after someone stops taking the stimulant, that's when you get what a lot of people call the crash, because the drug is leaving their system. And the brain's trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and it's trying to rebalance itself so you might feel totally exhausted, like you could sleep for a week straight. And then on top of that, your emotions are all over the place. You might feel really depressed or irritable or anxious all at the same time. It's like everything's turned up way too loud because the stimulant isn't there to kind of dampen things anymore.
It's almost like a rebound effect where the symptoms are even worse because the brain is so used to having that artificial stimulation.
Yeah, exactly. And then physically, you might get headaches, your muscles might ache, you might have these intense cravings for the stimulant. Some people even get chills or tremors or feel nauseous. It's not
Mhm.
fun.
This is heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you realize that stimulant withdrawal is really serious. It's not just like, oh, I'll power through a few days of feeling a little blah. These symptoms sound really intense, both physically and mentally.
Oh, absolutely. And for some people, it can even get more serious than that.
Yeah.
We're talking like hallucinations, seizures, even psychosis, and in really rare cases, it can even be life-threatening. So that's why it's so important to get help from a professional if you or someone you know is dealing with stimulant dependence, because trying to quit cold turkey on your own can be really risky.
So professional help is key, especially in those early stages of withdrawal when things are so unpredictable. But what does that actually look like? So professional help is key, especially in those early stages of withdrawal when things are so unpredictable. But what does that actually look like?
Well, it's not like there's one magic solution that works for everyone.
Yeah.
The best approach is usually a mix of different things depending on the person and their situation, but there are some key parts that are almost always involved.
Okay, so let's break those down. Where does it usually start?
A lot of times, the first step is what's called medical detox, and that's basically where you're in a safe, controlled environment with medical professionals who
Mm,
can help you manage those withdrawal symptoms, which, like we were saying, can be pretty rough.
right.
So they might give you medications to make you feel more comfortable. They'll keep an eye on you to make sure nothing goes wrong.
Yeah.
And they're just there to basically make sure you're as safe and as comfortable as possible while you're coming off the stimulant those first few days or even weeks.
So it's kind of like providing a safety net during that really vulnerable time when your body's trying to readjust.
Yeah, exactly. And detox is super important, but it really is just the first step. It's like, okay, you've got this big mess to clean up. You got to clear out all of the debris before you can even start rebuilding writing.
Right.
So dealing with the addiction itself means you got to go deeper, figure out what the root causes are, and come up with some healthy ways to cope so you don't end up using it again.
So what happens after detoxins? How do you actually help someone rebuild their life and avoid falling back into those old habits?
Well, that's where therapy comes in, and there's a lot of different approaches, but one that's been really effective is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CDT for short.
I've heard of that.
And basically, it helps you identify the negative thought patterns and those triggers in your life that might be contributing to your substance use. And then it gives you tools to challenge those thoughts and change those behaviors.
So it's like rewiring your brain to react in a different way to those triggers.
Exactly. And it's not just about one-on-one therapy either. Group therapy can be really helpful too. There are these support groups like Narcotics Anonymous or Smart Recovery, where you can connect with other people who are going through the same thing and share your experiences. And it's just a really good way to find support and stay accountable.
That sense of community can make such a big difference, right? Knowing you're not alone in this.
Absolutely. And it's not all about formal treatment settings. Either building a good support network outside of therapy is super important too, like having family and friends you can rely on, or even online communities, anyone who can offer you encouragement and understanding and just be there to listen. Because let's face it, recovery can be a really long and bumpy road, and having those people in your corner can make all the difference.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about how stimulants work their effects on the brain and body, the factors that influence their use, and how complex addiction and recovery really are. But if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that stimulant use isn't black and white. It exists on a spectrum. And especially given your interest in mention the listener's reason for wanting to learn about this topic, I think the question we're left with is this: how can we as a society cultivate a more balanced understanding of stimulants? How can we support people who genuinely benefit from their use while also addressing the very real dangers of addiction and making sure that people who need help can get it without feeling ashamed or judged? It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, but I hope this deep dive has given you a starting point for further exploration. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about stimulants, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions for ourselves and advocate for policies that promote both individual and public health.